Senate will come to order. The chaplain will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal God, the center of our joy, give our lawmakers this day the creativity and wisdom to solve problems and facilitate faith. As they seek to keep our nation strong, provide them with the long view of their work. Lord, remind them that it is better to fail in a cause that will ultimately succeed than to succeed in a cause that will ultimately fail. Bless them with humility, integrity, and compassion for the living of these days. And Lord, thank you for the exemplary and courageous life and legacy of former Secretary of State Colin Powell. Bless his family and loved ones and all those who grieve his death. We pray in your sovereign name. Amen.
Thank you. Please join me in pledging allegiance to the flag. Pledge allegiance. Read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., October 18th, 2021, to the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Mazie K. Hirono, a senator from the state of Hawaii, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President Pro Tempore.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session and resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, the Judiciary, Christine P. O'Hearn of New Jersey to be United States District Judge for the District of New Jersey.
Black Secretary of State who learned Yiddish, who learned Madam President.
Republican leader.
Today we learned that America has lost a trailblazing leader with the passing of Colin Powell. It's hard to imagine a more quintessentially American story. A son of Jamaican immigrants who learned Yiddish from his boyhood neighbors in the Bronx, becomes a four-star general in the United States Army and serves 4 presidential administrations, including as National Security Advisor, the youngest ever chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the first Black Secretary of State. As a young officer, General Powell rendered brave and distinguished service on the front lines. As a senior leader, he helped 4 presidents protect our nation, represent us on the world stage, and chart our course through uncertain and turbulent times that included the dawn of a new century and the beginning of our global war on terrorists who will not leave America alone, even if we leave them alone. Today, we remember and honor a man who truly dedicated his entire life to serving his country. Now, on an entirely different matter, there's a famous saying, if you find yourself in a hole, the first thing to do is to stop digging. Well, Madam President, my Democratic colleagues' policy decisions have dug our economy into a deep hole, and American families desperately need them to stop digging. The families of this country are currently battling the worst inflation in well over a decade. Over the last 12 months, consumer prices have shot up by 5.4%. Gasoline prices and food prices each increased by a full 1.2% just last month alone. That's just in 1 month. Year on year, groceries are about 4.5% more expensive than they were at this time in 2020. Let's look at housing. Rent jumped a full 0.5 percentage point just in September alone. That was the biggest monthly jump in 2 decades. On paper, American workers have been getting raises. The average worker's paychecks have gotten bigger over the last year, but the Democrats' inflation has cannibalized all those gains and then some. Any man or woman in the country who hasn't gotten a pay raise of 5.5% this year has effectively had their pay cut by the Democrat inflation. So, let me say it again, unless you've recently gotten a 5.5% raise, you've gotten a pay cut. And even if the households that have enjoyed pay raises are contending with major shortages of the things they want to buy and rapid and unpredictable price changes. Of course, none of the families that we represent need to hear these figures from experts on the news. They're living this reality every time they need to swing by the store, fill up their tank, or grab some essentials. What is especially remarkable and especially sad is that our nation's inflation nightmare was not unavoidable. These conditions are the product of intentional policy decisions made by Democrats over the objection of experts who warned exactly what would happen. Larry Summers, a leading economist and top advisor to each of the last 2 Democratic presidents, said just a few days ago, quote, "We're in more danger than we've been during my career of losing control of inflation and the U.S., end quote. That's Larry Summers just a couple days ago. The worst inflation risk he has ever seen? Mr. Summers was one of the many mainstream economists who warned the Biden administration what their policies would unleash. From the start, they tried to persuade Democrats not to ram through their historic glut of borrowing, printing, and spending. But alas, Democrats didn't listen. Back in the springtime, they used the pandemic as an excuse to pass a massive spending bill that the White House boasted was the most left-wing legislation in American history. Now, families are paying the painful price. The country's deep in this hole that Democrats dug. But they're showing no indication, none, that they want to stop digging. Led by our socialist colleague, the distinguished senator from Vermont, Chairman Sanders, Washington Democrats are plowing forward with yet another reckless taxing and spending spree that would make their huge inflationary package from the springtime look like child's play by comparison. They want the government to borrow and print multiple trillions more dollars and dump all that spending into the heads of families that are already struggling to stay afloat. Meanwhile, Democrats want to saddle a sputtering economy with the biggest peacetime tax hikes on record, obliterating President Biden's promise not to raise taxes for the vast majority of American families and leaving American job creators with tougher tax rates than businesses pay in communist China. Or look at energy prices. Americans are already paying more at the pump than they have in 7 years. But now our colleagues want to go beyond their war on gasoline and slap new taxes and new regulations on other domestic energy sources, such as natural gas. But winter is fast approaching. The whole world is stealing for huge price increases in natural gas. Our friends in Europe are frantically trying to secure their gas supply lines, and Russia is threatening to turn the continent's winter heating into a political hostage. But inexplicably, Democrats' response is essentially to have America stand down as an energy superpower. New taxes and new regulations on top of the inflation that is already wreaking havoc. Here was one headline last week, Madam President. Winter heating bills set to jump as inflation hits home. The story went on. With prices surging worldwide for heating oil, natural gas, and other fuels, the U.S. government said Wednesday it expects households to see their heating bills jump as much as 54% compared to last winter. This is the moment that President Biden is choosing to let the farthest left people in Washington, D.C. rewrite America's energy and environmental policy. Reckless liberal policies have dug America into a hole. Americans need Democrats to stop digging deeper. But the response from my colleagues across the aisle is to trade in their shovels for an excavator. Democrats want to keep digging deeper. They want to try to inflate their way out of inflation. It makes no sense whatsoever. It sounds as crazy as it is. No wonder this expensive socialist experiment is proving so very painful. It's not what American voters elected, and it's not what American families want. I suggest you have the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President, and he held some of the most important.
Aloha. Majority Whip.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Are we in a quorum call? I ask consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Madam President, like so many others in the Senate and across America, I was saddened to learn this morning of the passing of Colin Powell. In his lifetime, he broke down so many barriers, and he held some of the most important titles in this great nation: General of the United States Army, National Security Advisor, America's first Black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and our first Black Secretary of State. But before he held any of those positions, and after he stepped away from them, Colin Powell was always a patriot and a public servant. He was the son of immigrants, Jamaican immigrants, who raised their children to make the most of every opportunity that America offered, and to show their gratitude to this nation by giving back however they could. That story of opportunity and obligation is a story told by every immigrant parent to their children. It is the same story my mother taught to me and my brothers. Much has been said and written about Colin Powell's historic and distinguished career as a soldier and statesman. He was respected in a way that transcended partisan labels. He wasn't perfect. His speech in 2003 to the UN General Assembly claimed incorrectly that Iraq likely possessed weapons of mass destruction. It was based on information he was given and later learned to be false. It helped make a case for a war about which he had misgivings, and he would come to regret those remarks the rest of his life. But he never stopped trying to serve, even after leaving public office. In 2010, Colin Powell spoke out publicly about a cause that is deeply personal to many people, including myself. He and other military leaders urged this Senate to pass the DREAM Act, legislation that would give young immigrants who grew up in the United States a chance to earn their citizenship. Who better could speak to that issue than Colin Powell, son of immigrants who served this nation with distinction in combat and in public service. Regrettably, at the time, though a majority of senators supported the DREAM Act, it was filibustered and did not pass. Still, tens of thousands of immigrants are risking their lives today defending our nation in uniform. Among them may very well be another Colin Powell. It would be a fitting tribute to Secretary Powell for us to pass immigration reform now, this year, and recognize what a great patriot and immigrant like Colin Powell brought to this nation. One last point. Colin Powell survived one form of cancer nearly 20 years ago, and he was being treated for another when he passed away. Multiple myeloma, a form of blood cancer, weakens the immune system. So despite the fact that he was fully vaccinated, General Powell died of complications of COVID. It is sad and ironic that a man who spent so much of his life defending others from danger, in the end died from a common enemy that too many of our fellow citizens continue to deny, thus giving the virus an opportunity to replicate and wreak havoc. We are not each other's enemies. The virus is the enemy. Today, it claimed the life of an American statesman. By this time tomorrow, it will have taken another 1,500 Americans, family members, neighbors, heroes to many, especially for young children who can't be vaccinated yet, and for the millions of Americans with compromised immune systems. We've really got to increase our vaccination rates. Madam President, I'd like to speak on a different topic and ask to be placed in a separate part of the record. Ask consent.
Without objection.
Thank you. Well, last night, the world discovered that in Chicago, the sky is the limit. Our city of Chicago is home to a new team of champions. during the Women's National Basketball Association Finals at Wintrust Arena, the Chicago Sky mounted a comeback for the ages. In the fourth quarter, the team overcame an 11-point deficit to claim their first ever championship title. The victory was the culmination of an historic season. The record in the regular season was a mediocre 16-16. But in the run-up for the playoffs, the Chicago Sky won 8 postseason games, an all-time record for the WNBA. And from start to finish, last night's victory was truly a team effort. Hometown hero Candace Parker scored 16 points. She's nothing short of amazing, including a three-pointer that tied the game with less than 2 minutes left, sending the arena into an uproar. Kalia Copper was named the WNBA Finals MVP. Allie Quigley, a Joliet native, scored 26 points, and her wife and fellow teammate, Courtney Vandersloot, finished the game with 15 assists. All around, last night's victory was a legendary feat for the Chicago Sky. Tomorrow, our city will celebrate our new hometown champs in Millennium Park. I want to thank every member of the Chicago Sky for making Skytown proud, especially Michael Alter and John Rogers, 2 personal friends who brought the franchise to Chicago and have worked diligently to make it the best every step of the way. Last night they did. It's an inspiration to our city and to all the young players everywhere who want to look to a team that proves you should never quit. Finally, Madam President, today the Senate will vote to confirm Gustavo Gelpi to serve on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. Judge Gelpi is a highly qualified jurist with 2 decades of experience on the bench. When confirmed, he would be only the second judge of Hispanic origin and the second judge from Puerto Rico to serve on the First Circuit. I'd like to take just a moment to discuss his extensive qualifications and experience. Throughout his career, Judge Gelpi has dedicated himself to public service. Prior to his appointment to the bench, he gained a keen understanding of the need for fairness and impartiality in our system of justice. He worked as a public defender as well as prosecutor. He served in the Puerto Rican Department of Justice, where he handled criminal matters on behalf of the Attorney General of Puerto Rico. In 2001, Judge Gelpi was selected to serve as magistrate judge on the District of Puerto Rico. 5 years later, his impressive judicial record caught the attention of President George W. Bush, who nominated him to serve as district judge for the District of Puerto Rico. With Senate Republicans in the majority, Judge Gelpi's nomination received unanimous support in both the Senate Judiciary Committee and on the floor of the Senate. Having served as a federal judge for 20 years, Judge Gelpi is eminently qualified to sit on the First Circuit. He's already presided over 3,400 cases, 62 jury trials, issued almost 900 written opinions. Madam President, he's a real judge. He's well-versed in both complex civil and criminal matters, and was rated unanimously well qualified by the American Bar Association. Judge Gelpi's nomination is yet another example of the Biden administration and Senate Democrats working to advance judicial nominees who bring professional and democratic diversity to the federal bench. The fact that Judge Gelpi's been nominated by both Republican and Democratic presidents is almost historic, and it's certainly a testament to his even-handedness and fidelity to the rule of law. Leaders on both sides of the aisle trust that he will rule impartially and without regard for partisanship. Once he is confirmed as only the second judge of Hispanic origin to serve on the First Circuit, Judge Gelpi will help build a federal bench that truly reflects the diversity of America. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting Judge Gelpi's nomination. I yield the floor and suggest the essence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
respond to
The senator from Iowa,
I ask that the calling of the quorum be suspended.
without objection.
Earlier this month, Attorney General Garland released a memo instructing Department of Justice employees to respond to increasingly passionate school board meetings across the country. That memo talks about working to stop the violence and the threats of violence. That part of it is very fine, but unfortunately, the memo makes it sound like the Department of Justice might want to go after much more than just violence. Over the last year, school board meetings have turned from relatively calm local affairs to often boisterous meetings that are seen across the country. This began with parents who were upset after the school being closed last year, well after we learned that they could safely reopen in spite of COVID-19. Then these meetings grew to include pushback against mass mandates for students and against school districts adopting a curriculum known as critical race theory. There are many parents across the country who are upset about these things, and that is their right to be upset about them and to talk about them all they want to. After all, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. So here's the issue. The Attorney General's memo spoke of violence and threats of violence. Make no mistake about it. Violence should never be used to get what you want in politics. It's illegal for a good reason, and making real, true threats is illegal as well. They scare people, and that's not right. No one should ever threaten someone with violence just because they're angry about some school policy. Unfortunately, however, Department of Justice memos goes further than that. A person reading it might think a parent can't really speak his or her mind at a school board meeting. That spirited debate is not welcome. That very pointed and direct questions from educators to school board members aren't welcome. That deep disagreements are not welcome. Parents coming and speaking to their local school boards is what our democracy is all about. The essence of our representative system of governments, whether it's Congress, state legislatures, city hall, or school boards. We ought to be able to have civil discussion, and nobody ought to question that civil discussion. And of course, democracy also includes very passionate disagreements. If an elected official can't handle a passionate disagreement, then he or she shouldn't go into politics in the first place. And that goes for the president, that goes for this senator, that goes for every member on every school board in the country. Elected officials don't go crying to the FBI when constituents tell you something, how they're really feeling on an issue, regardless of how strong that feeling might be. If a parent is passionately advocating for her child at a school board meeting and school officials tell her she's out of line, the parent should not have to worry that the FBI is going to pay her a visit in her home after that meeting. She should not have to wonder whether the Patriot Act is going to be used to investigate her. It should never even cross that person's mind. If she does, then she might just stop talking altogether at a meeting, and you'd have a chilling effect on democracy. And that chilling effect, it's a very bad thing for democracies. In other words, it should never happen in the first place. So, it's critically important for the Attorney General to make very clear to everybody that short of violence and making true threats of violence, the federal government will have nothing to do with the crowds and the comments that people make at a school board meeting. All of my Republican colleagues on the Senate Judiciary Committee and I sent a letter to the Attorney General telling him just that. He should make clear to all Americans that unless there is a physical violence or threat of physical violence, federal law enforcement has nothing to do with local school board meetings. And he ought to take into consideration the capability of local law enforcement to take care of it in the first place. Now, Madam President, on another subject, I'd like to speak to an issue that is hurting the pocketbooks of hardworking Americans, particularly in the state of Iowa. The media has reported that the White House has been in discussions with Big Oil regarding rising fuel prices. Quite a surprise to some of us who have heard nothing from the administration all year that we got to stop fossil fuels. We got to worry more about global warming. You shouldn't stop big oil, but you still got to worry about global warming. President Biden has called on OPEC cartels to drill for additional crude oil and discuss potentially opening up our domestic strategic petroleum reserve. With rising energy prices, it is common sense to promote additional development of energy. But with the Biden administration's sole focus seemingly being on climate change, I would think more attention would be paid to promoting clean energy. Emphasis upon clean energy. Throughout my tenure in the Senate, I promoted alternative energy sources as a way of protecting our environment and increasing our energy independence. As the #1 producer of corn, ethanol, biodiesel, Iowa leads the nation's renewable fuels industry. But if the president doesn't care about Iowa, my state of Iowa, the president should remember the states of Illinois and Minnesota, just as an example. Historically blue states are also major producers of corn and soybeans, as well as ethanol and biodiesel. A recent study has shown the expanded use of ethanol under the renewable fuel standard has lowered gasoline prices by an average of 22 cents per gallon. This saves the typical American household $250 annually. In recent weeks, E10, which is a 10% mixture of ethanol and gasoline, E10 has sold for 35 to 50 cents per gallon less than gasoline with no ethanol. Not only is ethanol blended gas cheaper than non-ethanol gasoline, but a recent study has also shown that ethanol reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 43% compared to conventional gasoline. Considering President Biden's sudden interest in high gasoline prices. A common sense solution would be to turn to the biofuel industry for assistance in this time of high gasoline prices. Enhancing energy security while lowering emissions was the exact reason why Congress created the Renewable Fuel Standard in 2005 and 2007. The Midwest has the potential to provide a solution to the multifaceted problems that this administration faces. Instead, President Biden and his White House continue, it seems to me, to turn to big oil to solve the energy crisis, instead of looking at the renewable fuels opportunities. Big oil seems to then have a friendly relationship with the White House, which is completely contrary to what you think of when they want to do away with fossil fuels. Recent rumors in the press are saying that the administration is considering gutting the renewable fuel standard with massive cuts to the required volume obligations. This is strange considering President Biden campaigned on supporting the renewable fuel standard. He campaigned in Iowa as a friend of ethanol. Yes, in Iowa, President Biden said that, quote, the renewable fuel standard marks our bond with our farmers and our commitment to a thriving rural economy, end of quote. Increased drilling for crude oil and increasing our dependence on OPEC is not a solution to higher prices at the pumps. Why ask OPEC to pump more oil? Why ask big oil to pump more oil? Americans need relief, and that relief can come from having a partnership with the biofuels industry. And it is past time for then the administration to look to the heartland instead of Texas and OPEC for an answer. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Majority Leader?
Convene a quorum?
Yes,
Asked unanimous consent, the quorum be dispensed with.
without objection.
Now, Madam President, I begin today with the news that General Colin Powell, who served our nation as the first African-American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the first African-American Secretary of State, passed away this morning at 84. General Powell leaves behind a distinguished trailblazing legacy. Born in Harlem to Jamaican parents, he grew up with his sister and parents in the South Bronx, graduating from Melrose High School in the Bronx in 1954. At City College, his life changed forever when he joined the school's ROTC program, quickly becoming a standout member and earning his commission as second lieutenant in the Army after graduation. From humble beginnings, General Powell's career broke one glass ceiling after another. His life was a manifestation of the American dream, a true American success story. I join all Americans in remembering General Powell's life and his dedication to the country we love. My thoughts are with his wife, Alma, his 3 children, and his entire family. Now, Madam President, we begin a consequential work period for the U.S. Senate. Later today, we're going to move forward on the nomination of Gustavo Gelpi to serve on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. If confirmed today, and I believe it's Judge Gelpi, will be the second American citizen from Puerto Rico to be appointed to that court in its history. I cannot think of a better individual to succeed the late Judge Torruella. Judge Gelpi is a proven champion of civil rights and a defender of the rule of law. He began his career in Puerto Rico's Office of the Federal Defender. In 2006, was unanimously confirmed as a district judge for Puerto Rico. He brings both personal and professional diversity to the bench at a time when we desperately need both. I'm proud to have championed his nomination. Look forward to his confirmation today. Now on voting rights. This week, the Senate will have an opportunity to engage in a momentous and urgent debate, protecting the right to vote in free and fair elections. Later this evening, I'll begin the process for the Senate to consider the Freedom to Vote Act, a powerful new bill designed to fortify our democracy, protect the vote, and renew the American people's trust in our elections. After I file cloture tonight on the motions to proceed, members can expect the vote to take place on Wednesday. The Freedom to Vote Act is a balanced, effective, and common-sense bill. It sets basic standards for all Americans to vote safely and securely while protecting elections from subversion. It fights back against the power of big money and ends partisan gerrymandering while respecting the role of states in carrying out elections. The bill represents the first time every single Senate Democrat has united on voting rights legislation. It's a strong bill. It advances election reforms proven to work in red, blue, and purple states across the country. I thank my colleagues, all of my colleagues, for the work in putting this bill together. I thank them for their dedication in advancing the simple idea that all Americans, no matter what zip code they live in, should have the freedom to vote safely and securely. I want to particularly thank Senator Manchin, who has led the way in finding common ground with our Republican colleagues on this proposal. It's now time for us to move forward on this legislation as promised. Now, just so we're all clear, the vote that will happen on Wednesday is a procedural vote to begin debate on the bill. Voting yes does not mean signing on any policy or bill text. It's rather an invitation for senators to come to the table to debate, to deliberate, and compromise, just as the Senate was meant to do. If there's anything worthy of debate in this chamber, it should be protecting and strengthening our democracy. With everything we're seeing at the state level, the Senate must take action, and we must take action now. The right to vote is the beating heart of any democracy. I know we can both protect our elections and empower all Americans to have their voices heard. I hope we can do so together across the aisle. I implore my Republican colleagues to come to the table and work with us on this issue. I implore them to turn away from spurious claims of the big lie that are degrading faith in our democracy. I know many of my colleagues agree in their heart of hearts that we cannot allow our democracy to fall victim to conspiracy theories, subversion, and disinformation, but they must join us in working towards solutions. To be sure, Senate Democrats don't expect that our Republican colleagues will agree with every idea we have on voting rights. We know the disagreements run deep. But in this chamber, senators should not run away from debating the things we disagree about. If our Republican colleagues have good ideas, we're ready to work in good faith to listen to them, to consider them, and if they're aligned with the goals of this bill, to include them in the final text. But for any of that to happen, our Republican colleagues must agree to come to the table first. They should agree to let the Senate begin debate. That's all this first vote is. It says, are we willing to debate voting rights, sacred and important in our democracy? It is not acceptable to simply turn away from debating voting rights, to act as if the Congress has no role to play in the defense of free and fair elections, and simply pretend like there's nothing malicious afoot at the state level. No, inaction is not an option. The clock is ticking. The clock is ticking for this chamber to do something to protect our democracy before these dangerous laws take root for the next election. The Senate can rise to the task if given the chance, but it must be allowed to begin its work first. Republicans later this week will have a chance to go on record and show if they believe that protecting our democracy is worthy of this chamber's attention. Finally, a quick BBB update. Finally, Mr. President, this week Senate Democrats continue our work on finalizing our Build Back Better agenda. Congress right now has the best chance in years to make meaningful investments to help American families climb up to the middle class and stay in the middle class. By passing both the Build Back Better Act and the infrastructure bill, we can improve our nation's crumbling infrastructure, create good-paying jobs for the century, lower costs and cut taxes for American families, while taking overdue steps to meaningfully address the climate crisis. It's a difficult task, but we're committed to getting it done. Over the last week and weekend, I held many productive conversations with my colleagues here in the Senate, with Speaker Pelosi, and with the White House. We still have work to do. We all know in order to pass meaningful legislation, we must put aside our differences and find common ground within our party. As any bill of such historic proportions, not every member will get everything he or she wants. But at the end of the day, we will pass legislation that dramatically improves the lives of the American people. We will continue to make progress and keep working until the job is done. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, less than a month ago, President Biden made a surprising statement, or maybe I should say another surprising statement. He said, my Build Back Better agenda cost $0. $0. That's a big, you might even say, unbelievable claim. For starters, half of his agenda is a $1 trillion infrastructure bill that will increase the deficit by more than $250 billion over 10 years. The other part is a multi-trillion-dollar tax and spending spree, which leans on damaging tax hikes to cover a long list of social welfare programs to make the United States of America look more like, say, a European social welfare state. Now, how could that possibly cost $0? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It can't. Even the Washington Post fact checkers gave this claim 2 Pinocchios. This strategy of misleading, misstating, and I hate to say it, but there's no other word for it, downright lying to the American people is a tried and true strategy of the Biden administration. Whether it's advancing legislation or dodging a crisis, there's no promise that's too big to make, even if it's patently false. Another example. Dating back to the campaign trail, President Biden has repeatedly promised the American people, if you make over $400,000 a year, if you make under $400,000 a year, you will not pay more income tax. Well, we've heard the same talking points from the Treasury Secretary, Secretary Yellen, and the White House Press Secretary dutifully comes out and parrots the same position again and again and again. It's almost as if you say something often enough, people will begin to believe it, even if it's not true. Considering the enormous amounts of spending that the Biden administration has promised, I understand why they're a little worried about the truth. All of us like free stuff, whether it's a free t-shirt at a football game or free samples at a grocery store. What folks don't like, though, is learning that they're being played, that they're still paying, but maybe by a different means. So when it comes to free college, free child care, and other free programs under President Biden's agenda, most people realize there's no such thing as a free lunch. Somebody, somewhere, is going to have to pay for it. Even if it's borrowed money. The next generation, like our pages here, when they enter the workforce, they're going to be the ones that have to pay that money back. Somebody's going to have to pay it back. So there's no such thing as free. Contrary to the promises made by President Biden and his administration, the middle class will help to foot the bill for this spending bonanza. An analysis by the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation found that many families will see their taxes increase under President Biden's Build Back Better agenda. In 2023, 2 years from now, 18% of those earning between $75,000 and $100,000 will pay more in taxes, not $400,000 or more. More than a third of the folks earning between $100,000 and $200,000 a year will see a tax increase, not people making $400,000 or more. If this trend continues into 2027, well over half of taxpayers earning between $75,000 and $100,000 will pay more in taxes. And a whopping 86% of folks earning between $100,000 and $200,000 will see a tax increase. Now, you might wonder, how can the president have it so wrong? This is not news to President Biden. He knows better. He's surrounded by world-class economic advisors, analysts, and tax experts who scrutinize and scrub every single policy before it comes to see the light of day. Yet you might wonder, why does the president persist in claiming that his tax hikes won't impact the middle class, even as he's trying to slip them a massive tax bill? I hate to state the obvious, but it's just dishonest. Of course, all this comes at a time when many family budgets are already underwater, struggling to recover from the fiscal impact of COVID-19. Now, from gas stations to grocery stores to electricity bills and restaurant checks, the American people are being pummeled by inflation, paying more for the things that they used to pay less for. What's the Biden administration response? Well, the president's chief of staff, Ron Klain, dismissed inflation as something he called a high-class problem, which I guess means that only rich people are suffering or experience that inflation. Again, this is clearly not true. My constituents in Texas don't see it that way. They see inflation outpacing their wage increases and essentially giving them a pay cut. They're paying 10% more at the butcher counter than they were a year ago, 42% more on gasoline. If you're a senior operating on a fixed income, you have to spend more of that fixed income to end up with less. So no, this isn't just a problem for the high class. Unfortunately, it's not going away soon either. You remember when concerns were raised with the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jay Powell, about inflation. He said, well, it's probably only transitory, meaning it's a passing moment. Well, now we see that economists expect inflation rates to remain steady through the end of next year, which would mark the longest period of inflation above 5% in 3 decades. So if inflation is at 5%, that means you're having to pay $1.05 to get what you used to pay $1 for, and it's compounded each year. While inflation is expected to ease some, or at least we're hoping and praying that's the effect, by the middle of next year, rates are still likely to be higher than they were before the pandemic. Folks who can't afford to fill up their gas tanks to get back and forth to work or buy what they need at the grocery store don't need to be told that things are just fine when they know they're not. The American people need to see real leadership here that addresses the root causes of inflation, not pouring gas on that inflation as the $3.5 trillion reckless tax and spending spree would do. It would just create more money chasing the same goods and services, driving prices up. And the American people certainly deserve better than false statements that ignore the magnitude of their pain. But as I said before, we've seen this playbook again and again. Following an objectively chaotic exit from Afghanistan because of the president's arbitrary decision date, President Biden called the mission an extraordinary success. Well, we know that's not true. We can see that with our own eyes. We know that 13 brave service members lost their lives in a terrorist attack, including a young Marine named David Espinoza, whose funeral my wife and I attended in Laredo, Texas. Countless Americans and Afghan allies were left behind. We heard from the State Department today, they can't even tell us how many Afghans who qualify for the special immigrant visa remain in Afghanistan. And we know now with the Taliban in control that they are hunting down people who worked with the United States during the last 20 years in order to prevent another terrorist attack like we experienced on 9/11/2001. And no, the new Taliban is not better or a kinder, gentler version of the old Taliban. So in no way could this be considered a success, let alone an extraordinary one. And then there's the border. Ever since President Biden became president, his administration has either ignored, downplayed, or denied the humanitarian crisis at our border. For months, the administration wouldn't even talk about it. And when it did, there were very peculiar rules that applied apparently to how it should be discussed. The administration refused to use the term crisis and came up with a range of euphemisms to downplay what was actually happening. They called it a challenge, a situation, a mess, all to apparently deceive the American people into thinking that what you're seeing with your own eyes is not really a problem. The Secretary of Homeland Security took this deception to a whole new level recently. When testifying before a House committee last week, Secretary Mayorkas said the border is, quote, no less secure than it was previously, close quote. That, Madam President, is demonstrably false. The data tell a very clearly different story. In the first 7 months of the Biden administration, more than 1.2 million migrants have crossed our southern border. That's an astronomical number, 1.2 million. provide some context, in 7 months, Customs and Border Protection encountered 2.5 times as many people as they did in all of fiscal year 2020. So it's not getting any better. Yet the Secretary of Homeland Security, whose responsibility it is to secure the border, says things are no worse off than they used to be. At the same time, he tells us that the numbers are unrivaled in the last 20 years. Both can't be true. So whatever you want to call this, lying, misleading, or gaslighting, we've all had to learn a little bit of a new vocabulary. Gaslighting basically means creating your own alternative reality and trying to sell that as true. Well, none of this changes the fact that the Biden administration has consistently tried to deceive the American people about each of these matters, and the list actually goes on and on. The president and his administration won't even admit there's a humanitarian crisis along our southern border, let alone take the pretty obvious and necessary steps to address it. Senator Sinema from Arizona, a Democrat, and I, a Republican from Texas, working with Henry Cuellar, a Democrat from Laredo, and Tony Gonzalez, a Republican who represents the largest border district in the country. We presented the bipartisan border security plan, but the administration just looks the other way. They won't acknowledge their massive failures in Afghanistan either, which resulted in the death of 13 service members and left our allies, our friends, and their families in a lurch. And they refuse to admit that their reckless tax and spending spree bill is designed to fundamentally transform America and will drive up taxes, not just for the wealthy, but for the middle class, and hurt our already wobbly post-pandemic economy. This is not what leadership should look like. The American people deserve better than getting scammed by their own president, no less. If the administration put half as much energy into trying to solve problems as it does in trying to dissemble about them or to cover them up, our nation would be far better off. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. For the past several months, the Biden administration and their officials have devoted their time to one of two things. They have blamed Republicans for problems that they, the Democrats, created, or denying those problems exist at all. As my colleague said from Texas, as he said, don't believe what you're seeing. That seems to be a common refrain. Just last week, White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain retweeted the former chairman of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors when he dismissed rising inflation and collapsing supply chains as, and I quote, high-class problems, end quote. Apparently, he thinks those sky-high prices at the grocery store only affect the rich. How wrong they are. On the same day, Ron was scrolling through Twitter. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki insisted that the American people just started paying attention to their finances this year. Never before this year have they looked at their finances. She stood in front of the entire press pool, dismissed serious economic pain as a passing concern, and tried to spin the memory of the pre-pandemic, pre-Biden economy out of everyone's memory. Last week, I saw firsthand the consequences of this policy of deflection. Let me tell you, If you want to see what it looks like when our government undermines and abandons entire communities, you need look no further than our nation's southern border. What I saw during my recent trip to South Texas was a humanitarian crisis, a healthcare crisis, and a national security crisis. And make no mistake, nothing that's happening down there is the result of some unfortunate accident. This is no everyday failure of leadership. If our so-called border czar cared at all about doing her job, she would know that every single Border Patrol agent needs to hear from her. Law enforcement officers, they want to hear from her. And property owners in the area believe with absolute certainty that this issue on the southern border, this is a fixable issue. It is fixable. Madam President, our Border Patrol agents want to do their job, but they are undermined every step of the way by the official policies of an administration that has spent billions of dollars canceling construction of the border wall. That is correct. They're spending your money, your taxpayer dollars, your hard-earned money, canceling contracts, canceling construction of the border wall. And they have stripped resources that the Border Patrol need, pulling back resources like surveillance technology, pulling back funding that could help pay overtime for Border Patrol officers. They pulled all of that back from the Department of Homeland Security, doing it even as the number of migrants that are surging the border are increasing, even as the apprehensions at the border are increasing. They're reducing the resources that the Border Patrol agents have. During conversations with these agents, we all came to the conclusion that most Americans have no idea how truly serious this problem is, which is the logical conclusion of another Biden administration policy of blocking press access to key areas of the border. They do not want you to see or hear about what is going on. They don't want you to see the chaos they've created, and they surely don't want us to see the trail of destruction left by this flood of illegal immigration. So they don't want the press down there. They don't want them to get the message out about what is happening, how our southern border is being overrun and our Border Patrol overworked. At this point, not only me, but many of my colleagues, and there are some on both sides of this aisle, have documented for the record the horrific journey migrants undertake from Central America to the United States. And yes, migrants are coming from 150 different countries through Central America and Mexico to our southern border. We know that the cartels are in complete control of that border on the Mexico side. And you know what, Madam President? The cartel, you have to pay them, gotta pay them in order for them to get you here. You get to the river, you gotta pay the river tax to a coyote who works for the cartel in order to cross the river. The cartel controls who gets into the United States of America. Yes, it is illegal entry, but think about this. The cartels are in control. In South Texas, there are 3 cartels that are working that border. Different parts of that border, big business for these cartels. And yes, we know about drugs and weapons and sex trafficking and gangs and human trafficking in South Texas. They have caught members from 88 different gangs, 88, that are moving their people into this country. Madam President, they're not coming here for a better life and a job. They're coming here because gangs, they carry out crime. But what many Americans haven't seen and witnessed is the impact all this has on your average border community. When I was in Texas, I had the privilege of speaking to ranchers and other property owners dealing with the nightmare of regularly discovering the remains of dead adult migrants, sometimes discovering children. Now, traffickers abandon these individuals while they're crossing some of the ranchers and the property owners' property. Just abandoning these people right there on their property. Now, these property owners are also forced to spend time and energy repairing damage that is inflicted to their property by the trespassers who are trying to avoid the checkpoints that are north of the border. We're talking about an emotional and a practical toll that has crept outward from the border, away from those remote ranches and outposts, and into communities all across this country. Administration officials started all this with their open border rhetoric, but they could also put a stop to it. How? By holding themselves accountable to the people that are stuck trying to control this chaos. People like Hector and Chris and their fellow Border Patrol agents who risk their lives every day to keep us safe. They said, you know, it's like doing your job with one hand tied behind your back. And then they say, okay, we're going to try to strap down the other hand a little bit. That's right. That's what it means when you talk about removing resources, removing surveillance, pulling back money so they can't go do the job that they want to do, that they signed up to do to keep this country safe. Everybody in this administration should spend a few minutes talking with property owners like Susan and like Richard and think about what it must feel like to constantly wonder if somebody has died of exposure in your backyard. This is what they're dealing with every day. The federal government's not out there repairing fences that have been torn down. The federal government is not out there cleaning up trash. The federal government is not there replanting a sugarcane field. No. Ranchers, property owners, they are paying for this out of their pocket because this is happening on their property. The status quo that this administration has created on this border can't last much longer because it is running people ragged, whether they're working the river, working the border, whether they are trying to work their ranch, their cattle, their crops. Madam President, this is out of control. The other thing that I've noticed as I was on the border and then talking to a lot of Tennesseans, hearing from people, the American people are afraid. The spin doctors in the White House and in the mainstream media would have us believe that fear is due to racism or xenophobia. But those accusations are misstatements. They are inaccurate. Americans are not afraid of those who seek refuge in our country. Americans are afraid of the documented rise in drug trafficking and gun running and sex trafficking. They're infuriated to see how their own fellow citizens throwing in their lot with the drug cartels and participating in these trafficking rings. People in their communities are choosing blood money over gainful employment, and they hold these cartels responsible. And they fear the hold the cartels have over some of their neighbors. It terrifies them. But what terrifies them most of all is the knowledge that President Biden, his cabinet, and his allies in Congress know this, and they refuse to help. We know the problem is fixable. As the Border Patrol agents told me, this is fixable. There are solutions. We know the administration has the power to do it. It's pretty simple. And this is what they've said. Enforce the rule of law. There are laws on the book. Enforce them. Illegal entry is illegal. They say start by building the wall. Build it, finish it, get it finished. They need it. They've been saying it for 30 years. We need a wall. We need a wall. Border Patrol and other law enforcement agencies have been asking for this barrier for a long time. And if you were to go down south, you would see for yourself. Everything you need to build that border is there. The equipment, the panels, it is all there. Build the wall. Part of it is up, but we need to fill it in so that we secure that border and additional funding for security and infrastructure and manpower. Build that wall. Get back to work on it. Next, the administration must stop waging war against President Trump's successful Remain in Mexico policy. The Border Patrol, law enforcement, the Texas Department of Public Safety, the National Guard, they will all tell you, yes, get back to building that wall, and while you're at it, go back to Remain in Mexico. You know what, Madam President? They want this because it works. It works. Isn't that amazing? It works. So go back to it. We cannot afford to allow the operatives at the helm of the Democratic Party to dictate security policy. We know Remain in Mexico works. So embrace it. Say, we're doing this because federal employees, the Border Patrol, are asking us to do this. We must also eliminate catch and release and embrace the removal authority granted under Title 42. Those are things that we know work. Those are the things at the top of the list with our local law enforcement, with Texas DPS, with our Border Patrol. Those are the things, Madam President, that they say, these could be done right now. Go back to building that wall. Go back to Remain in Mexico. Stop this catch and release and abide by Title 42. Today, President Biden, who hasn't been to the border, should go. and say, you know what? This nation is a sovereign nation. We are going to protect this nation. We are going to protect our citizens. And therefore, we are going to take these measures because the Border Patrol says this is what works. The time for treating these policies like political footballs has come to an end. The border crisis doesn't exist in a bubble. And it doesn't just exist at the southern border. What we are seeing along that border is loss of life and loss of livelihoods. And it is happening on a daily basis. How would you feel? How would you feel if they were running across your crops? How would you feel if they were on your ranch? Think about that one. It's clear by now that the White House values their woke talking points, but there is nothing woke about the death and destruction we're seeing tear through this border. There is nothing woke about allowing the cartels to overwhelm law enforcement and leave innocent people entrapped by those cartels to die in the desert. There is nothing woke about allowing a crisis to fester to make the political case for open borders. Until President Biden and the Democrats prioritize safety and secure the border they abandoned on the day that they took power and control, every town in this country will be a border town, and every state will be a border state. Every community will exist under the threat of cartel violence, and every person in America will bear witness to the desperation and loss of life that their president has seen fit to ignore. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Montana.
Madam President, first of all, thank you for the recognition. I want to share a few words this afternoon to honor an incredible leader, somebody that is well known to the state of Montana, certainly well known to Indian country, throughout this country, a personal friend of mine that passed away last week. The person's name was Chief Earl Oldperson in the Blackfeet Nation. He served 56 years as tribal councilman. He passed away last Wednesday, October 13th, at the age of 92. He was the longest-serving elected tribal official in the United States when he passed. He was a keeper of tribal history, a tireless advocate, and for many, he was a national voice for the challenges in Indian country. Chief Oldperson was born in 1929. He grew up on the Blackfoot Reservation, where he embraced tribal culture, and at a young age, performed traditional Blackfeet song and dance across the state and the nation as an ambassador for the Blackfeet. He even traveled to Paris to represent Indian country as the only Indian Boy Scout at the World Boy Scout Jamboree in 1947. It was clear that leadership was in his bones. And in 1954, he was elected to his first term as a tribal council member, and he became the tribal council chairman only 10 years later. Chief Oldperson went on to serve as president of the National Congress of American Indians. He played an integral part in creating the nation's first tribally owned bank, helping to earn him the honor of being named Outstanding Indian of the Year by the Chicago Indian Council. In 1978, Earl Oldperson became Chief Earl Oldperson, a title that he would hold with honor until his passing last Wednesday. In his role as chief, he would not only represent the Blackfeet tribe, but all tribal nations in Montana, and on the Governor's Task Force on Indian Affairs, and as a chairman of the affiliated tribes of the Northwest. He met with every president, every United States president, from Truman to Obama,
and had joined the British royal family and Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau for the Commonwealth Games in 1978. Wherever he went, he was pushing for progress. There are too many honors and awards for me to name, but Chief Olsperson's impact goes far beyond his accolades. He was a wise leader, a world-class orator, and I've heard stories of his words that brought folks to tears. His shoes will never be filled, but the fact that we had the opportunity to see his leadership in action gives us a roadmap for a brighter future. He will sorely be missed by the Blackfeet Nation, by the state of Montana, by Indian country across this country, and my wife Charlotte and I, as well as countless others who knew him. This world is a better place because of Chief Olsperson and the work that he did. He will never be replaced. Madam Chairman, Madam President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from Montana,
I ask the quorum call be eviscerated.
without objection. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, the judiciary, Gustavo A. Gelpi of Puerto Rico to be United States Circuit Judge for the First Circuit.
The question occurs on the nomination. Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Paul. House, aye. No, Mrs. Capito. No. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Portman, no. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Romney, no. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Hoeven, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Cruz, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 51, the nays are 42. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions. Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I want to address a topic this afternoon here in the U.S. Senate that I believe not enough people are talking about. It's something that I certainly heard a lot about when I was back home in Alaska, and I think it's something that millions of Americans are talking about, but nobody here on the Senate floor is talking about. But we should be, because this goes to constitutional authority, and it goes to what I believe means to be an American: freedom, liberty. And it's this: the executive order that the President Biden, issued mandating vaccinations for both federal contractors and private employers. In essence, what he has said in this executive order, we're still waiting on the rule, is that employers need to have people who are vaccinated, all their employees, by a certain date, or they're going to be fired. That's the President of the United States saying he has that power to force employers to make their employees decide between a vaccination or putting food on the table for their families. Vaccination or you're fired. We're not talking about that. And Mr. President, this is unprecedented. Unprecedented. Never before has a president claimed the authority to actually do this. The military is a different exception. Private employers who have some connection to the federal government or otherwise, tell your employees, get vaccinated or you're fired. And the President of the United States is claiming the constitutional authority to do that. I don't even think it's a close call. I don't even think it's a close call. It's never been done before, and I don't even think it's a close call whether the President has constitutional authority to do this. Think about if he did, what this could mean for power in other realms that the executive branch or President would have. Now, I'll stipulate right here, I'm vaccinated. I've encouraged others to get a vaccine in consultation with their doctors. We all want to put this pandemic behind us. No doubt about it. The vaccinations help with that. But that doesn't mean there should be an excuse to look the other way when the President is acting in an unconstitutional manner. And there are many reasons, certainly with regard to my constituents, that people might be hesitating with regard to a vaccine. Some of them have health conditions that preclude them from taking a vaccine. Some of them may have serious religious objections to the vaccine. Some of them have histories of abuse and don't trust the federal government or the medical establishment. Some of them have dug in their heels and believe the government simply doesn't have the right to tell them what substance to put in their bodies. The President of the United States is taking this unprecedented, and it is unprecedented, action. Get a vaccine, or the federal government will mandate you get fired. That it's not just, in my view, unconstitutional, but it shows contempt for hardworking Americans. Contempt that I see percolating again and again among some in the far left. Think about it. You don't say what you think we should say, you're fired. You work for an industry that used to power America, but now is out of favor with some on the left. Oil, gas, coal, especially in Alaska, as the presiding officer knows. We'll shut down your business, and we'll make sure your employees are fired. You speak your mind about an issue, you're fired. You don't take a vaccine, you're fired. Oh, by the way, I think the federal deadline on the vaccination put out by the president is December 8th. So you're going to be fired right before the holidays. Now, Mr. President, as you know, this is a 180-degree turn, 180 about face, with regard to what this body did last year. What do I mean? So we worked in a bipartisan way during 2020 when the pandemic hit, particularly the CARES Act. I think every U.S. senator voted for that. But the other relief that we worked hard on, Democrats and Republicans. When the historians look back at 2020, there's going to be a lot of things, but I think one good thing is they're going to say the Congress of the United States came together, no playbook, we certainly had never seen this before, came together to help the American people. Democrats, Republicans, the president, that was President Trump, on relief. And here's the thing, this is why I mean it's a 180-degree turn. One of the core principles of all the relief packages that we passed last year, the aviation relief packages that helped our airlines, the PPP program, throughout all the relief bills that passed this body in a bipartisan way, one critical component was we need to make sure employers and employees stay connected. Almost all the relief said, all right, airline industry, we can't let you go under. You got to stay safe in terms of the ability to fly for the American people. You're going to get billions and billions and billions in relief, but you can't fire your employees. You have to keep them connected. The PPP program, the estimates are tens of millions of Americans kept their jobs because of that program. You got relief, small business in America, but you can't fire your employees. That was the agreement. That's what we worked on. That was the core principle that helped us get through the pandemic economically. Joe Biden is taking a sledgehammer to that connection. It's actually the exact opposite. We're still challenged by the pandemic. Our economy is still challenged. But what's he doing? If you don't listen to Joe Biden, private employers in America, you have to fire your employees. That's exactly the opposite of how this body worked. Across the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, the previous president, the approach was, we're going to help you, but you have to keep your employees. That's the right approach. That's the right approach. And yet no one's talking about this new approach from the new president. Do what I say, even though I don't have the constitutional authority. You have to get a mandate, even though I don't have the constitutional authority. And if you don't, I'm going to make sure private employers fire their employees. Oh, right before Christmas. Doesn't anyone have a problem with this? Well, I have a problem with this. And again, I think people should get vaccinated. I just don't think the President of the United States has the constitutional authority to tell Americans, do it or you're going to get fired. So, Mr. President, here's what I hope. I've been reaching out to some of our business leaders to make a respectful request. And it's this. You don't want to fire your employees. Heck, this country doesn't have enough people who are working right now. You have the Biden economy, which is long lines, super high energy prices, people who aren't working, empty shelves. We need more workers. We certainly don't need the President of the United States telling employers, fire your people prior to Christmas. But that's what he's doing. So here's what I think, respectfully, our business leaders should be doing. They should be looking and remembering what we did last year. For example, if you're an airline executive, we all worked really hard to make sure we continued to have air service for America, and it was safe, and that you kept your employees. So what our business leaders should be doing is saying, respectfully, Mr. President, it's highly unlikely you have this authority. And I don't want to fire my employees. The best business leaders I know are very loyal to their employees. So hold off. Don't fire them because Joe Biden says you have to. The litigation that's going to play out in this country, he almost certainly is going to lose. Almost certainly. I don't think there's a court in America that says the President of the United States, without Congress's permission or passing a law, that the President of the United States on his own has the power to go to private sector employees and say, your employees have to get vaccinated or you, Mr. Employer, have to fire them. I think the President's going to lose that case in every court in America. So if you're a business leader, here's my respectful request. Hold off. Wait for the litigation to play out. And don't fire your employees because the President has told you to, because they haven't gotten vaccinated before Christmas. You know, we're already starting to see this. Some business leaders are taking a different approach, not this, hey, do what I said or you're fired. They're offering financial incentives, hiring medical advisors to talk to their employees. They're allowing medical and religious exemptions. They're offering testing as an alternative to forcing the vaccine on their workers. And I read about one today, have had discussions with others who are saying, look, it's not our intention to fire our employees right before Christmas. These are the leaders who are saying they value and trust their employees. Like what we did last year. Here's significant relief, businesses in America, but don't fire your employees. As a matter of fact, you can't if you accept this aid, which they didn't. So these are the leaders who value their employees. And at the end of the day, Mr. President, this is the approach that's going to work. It's going to work better for all of us. For these businesses, their workers, their communities, in our country. I wish the President would take note of this, but right now, he seems hell-bent on doing a 180 from what we did last year. And again, that was encouraging businesses to work through the pandemic while keeping their employees, not ordering in an unconstitutional manner the firing of employees because Joe Biden said so. I yield the floor.
Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, on roll call vote 414, I voted no. It was my intention to vote aye. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to change my vote since it will not affect the outcome.
Without objection.
Thanks.
President,
Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar 414.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Education, Catherine Elizabeth Lehman of California to be Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights.
Cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 414, Catherine Elizabeth Lehman of California to be Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, Department of Education, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to calendar 125, Senate 2747.
Clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to S-2747, a bill to expand Americans' access to the ballot box and reduce the influence of big money in politics and for other purposes.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 125, S-2747, a bill to expand Americans' access to the ballot box and reduce the influence of big money in politics and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
Finally, I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum calls for the cloture motions filed today, October 18th, be waived.
Without objection.
I yield the floor. Why did I yield the floor? Claim the floor. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of S-Res 420 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 420, relating to the death of the Honorable Adlai Ewing Stevenson III, former Senator for the state of Illinois.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration, and the Senate now proceed to S-Res 417.
Clerk will report.
S-Res 417, recognizing Hispanic Heritage Month and celebrating the heritage and culture of Latinos in the United States and the immense contribution of Latinos to the United States.
Without objection, the committee is discharged, and the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate Res 421 submitted earlier today.
Clerk will report.
S-Res 421, supporting the goals and ideals of National Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I further ask the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Finally, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 10 a.m. Tuesday, October 19, that follow the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. That upon the conclusion of morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the O'Hearn nomination. Further, that the Senate recess following the cloture vote on the O'Hearn nomination until 2:15 to allow for the weekly caucus meetings. That if cloture is invoked on the nomination, all post-cloture time expire at 2:20 p.m. Finally, if the nomination is confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
For the information of senators, the first roll call of the day will be at 11:30 a.m. If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask it stand adjourned under the provisions of S-Res 420.
Under the previous order and pursuant to S. Res. 420, the Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. on Tuesday, October the 19th, 2021, and does so as a further mark of respect to the late Adlai Ewing Stevenson III, former senator from Illinois.